just doing it once more. Good evening. We are on the Madras Week celebrations, lecture 2. Today is Penang and Chennai, rejuvenating the city. Before I begin the lecture, I just want to tell a small anecdote. A few years back, almost 10 years back, I was in Malaysia. And as a Tamilian, one of the places that I wanted to visit was Kedah, because we have always heard about this Kadaram Kondan, Rajendra Chola. And I went to Kedah. And when I went there, when I went around the museum, the exhibits that they had over there, I saw all the old temples that have been reassembled, the artifacts, the museum, and all that. Finally, there was one place which I was like, when I read that, I was stunned. For the antiquity of Kedah, they were talking about a Tamil text, the Sangam Tamil text. And they said Kedah gets referred in the ancient Sangam Tamil text. And I searched for it. It was Kalahatha Akam. Silappadiharam talks about it, which means it was basically goods coming into Pumbuhar, one of the old Tamil ports, ancient ports. The goods were being taxed, and the products that were coming from Kedah, which was known as Kalaham, and in Arabic it was known as Kalha, I think. I don't get the pronunciation right. And those products were known as Kalahatha Akam. So we do not know what were the products that were coming from Kedah, but it was coming. You know, in the Sangam days itself, the trade was there. And that was a huge surprise for me that Sangam texts were talking about this trade that existed. Now we are talking about a 2,000-year-old thing. And not only that, I think as author Sunil Amrit, will talk about in his talks about in his book Crossing the Bay, the trans Bay of Bengal migration is something that is less spoken about. And in our promotion, we had said the sea as a link. Sea was never a barrier. It was a link which was constantly, transporting people this way, and the people are moving, from this shore to that shore. So for us in the Tamil country, the Southeast Asia was a backyard, and to them similarly. It was not that these are two distant places. People were constantly moving back and forth. So this heritage extends to a very ancient period, and it continued. One of the Tamil novels, classical novel, which is Pa Singaram's Puyille Oru Thoni, which has been translated. The whole novel is set in Second World War time in Penang and Southeast Asia. When I read that, I understood the enormous importance that INA played and the enormous importance, the role that Tamils had in INA. It was discovered that INA workers were dockyard workers. INA people afterwards, became dockyard workers in Penang. These sort of things. So the Tannimalayan temple, I was able to visit all those things. The Little India, the Chettiar Kittangis, so much. And I realized that when Penang became the fourth presidency, the early settlements were from Madras presidency. So we have these whole long connections, and connections still extend. So without further elaborating, there are two fantastic speakers we have. One is Hamdan Abdul Majid, who is the managing director of Think City, which has done a fantastic work in regenerating the city, in getting Penang where it is. And we have Dr. Srivatsan, who is an urban architect, who has written a number of articles. He's also a journalist, as a professor. So both of them will be discussing about the two cities and what we can learn from one another. So I hand over the mic to Hamdan Abdul Majid to start his talk on Penang and his experience, to share his experiences. Thank you.
Anwar, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity, and I think you have done a wonderful introduction and made my presentation a much easier one. As you have said that the connection between the two regions is one that predates the colonial history. In fact, it dates back way back to the first century AD, where there were deep connection between these two, and the sea, as what you have said, was not a divider but rather was a link. And these communities had a long history of trade and civilization, and this is reflected in recent archaeological findings that were found in Kedah, which dates back to the first AD. In fact, the image here on the left that indicates shows a shipwreck of built by the Kedah civilization that dates to 110 AD. Now, like in all likelihood, Kedah was the staging ground for the larger growth of the Hindu-Buddhist civilization in the ASEAN region, and reflected by the Angkor Wat temples in Khmer and the Borobudur temple in Indonesia, which were built at a much later date. As we know now today, the Bujang Valley civilization is the oldest in Southeast Asia and probably was the most significant in the region. And its link to the southern coast of India was primarily trade and exchange of goods and so on. And it is interesting that the navigational capabilities that were there then were able to transport iron and elephants, and this were in the historical text. If you were to look at Ken Chowdhury's publication, Trade and Civilization in the Indian Ocean, from 750 to 1750, a lot of the old records indicate the kind of the depth of the kind of trade and civilizational links. And this eventually is reflected in the type of growth of this particular region. And obviously this predates the presence of the British. Now the British entry into the region it starts in the early 17th century, where they were looking for a staging ground into the ASEAN region. And one of the early places that they started was in Bencoolen in Sumatra. However, Bencoolen's suitability, given that it is open to the on the other the western coast of Indian Ocean, was not necessarily suitable for the purposes of what they had in mind. And principally at that point in time, they were looking at growing their trade in spice and control of the spice trades and so on. In fact, nutmeg was one of those properties that they were looking out for in the Spice Islands. And Penang probably was one of the early staging grounds that James and Kester came and stopped, and the island eventually became named as Pulau Pinang, and this was a place where they came in for water and supplies. Now, when Francis Light established an organized settlement, this was some of the early images of what Penang would have looked like in 1786, and a small settlement that eventually has transformed to become a large global enterprise. In fact, Penang became a dynamic, what they call, port city with a free port status, and the British eventually established as the fourth presidency. Now, this links with the British history is interesting in a sense that it was not only that they used this, but rather they interconnected southern India and the northern region of Malaysia more closely, where we saw that there was the presidency, as we know, and how administration was coordinated between the two regions. And but we also saw the large-scale migration of people from India to Malaysia and from other parts of the region, from China and the larger ASEAN region. Eventually, we saw the growth of in the emergence of hybrid communities, as we know them locally as the Peranakan communities. And the shared history is something that continues and reflected in deeper in terms of architecture and urban landscapes. If you come to Penang today, it's still there, where we have seen the adaptation of construction methods from India. Indian laborers were particularly used in public infrastructure work such as construction of roads, drains, and public buildings. In fact, it was known during the period that the road building was all done by the Indian community. In fact, road contractors were from India. And in the case of the British officers, some of the officers were also used both in Chennai as well as in Penang. This is a map done by Kelly. It's known as the Kelly map. The Superintendent of Survey, F.W. Kelly, was sent to Penang by the Survey of India, and he served in Madras prior to his transfer to Penang. So this was some of the evidence that we have used in our process of regenerating the city. This is another example. On the left is St. George's Cathedral in Chennai, which was built by Captain Robert Smith, who was from the Madras engineers, who also was involved in the building of the St. George's Cathedral in Penang. And so what we would like to highlight is to say that there has been a very long, deep connection and a shared history between the two regions. And that's one of the things that we felt over the years. As we gain independence, the close relations has something that has been lost over time, and it's one that we are now rediscovering. And hopefully, this is one of those new conversations that we are starting. Let me pass the mic over to Dr. Srivatsan to hear this from his perspective.
Thank you, Anwar, and nice meeting you, Amdan. I've read what you're doing at Penang, and late Mutaya had written a few years ago a wonderful and a fondly admiring piece about the work that you have been doing in Penang, and particularly the way you have rejuvenated Georgetown. I'm very keen, like everyone else here, to listen how you have rejuvenated the city, and particularly the older parts of the city. Both of you have covered good ground about the pre-colonial connections between Chennai and Penang. What I would like to do is start from the colonial period, look at the urban history of Chennai, and move quickly to the post-colonial times, and sort of wrap up by saying what state Chennai is now, hoping that after I finish, you could explain of what you have done to your city after your independence, and show
Sure.
us what kind of things that you're doing, and probably we can share notes and experiences, and something productive can come out of this conversation. Okay, so let me begin my presentation, and I'm not going to talk to the slides or with the slides. I'm just going to let the slides run in the background, but I would narrate the aspects of urban history in Chennai and what its current status and why and how we landed up there. Okay, so give me a minute. Okay, now I'm going to start playing this. As I told you, I'm not going to explain the slides or talk with the slides, and it will keep continuing. As you would know, Chennai is the fourth largest metropolis today, and it's a sort of accumulated city. In its fabric, it accumulates different parts of its history, and you would find the city as a very sometimes overwhelming collage. You would be able to still see and trace certain parts of its history because it's not like a palimpsest. At some places, it has been erased and overbuilt. In some places, it kind of sort of rubs shoulders. Sometimes it sort of superimposes the different layers of history is still visible and traceable. Uh, the, the formation of Chennai, or Madras as it was then known, uh, is a product of trade, and not because the colonial powers discovered the potential of trade of the Coromandel coast as it was known. Much before even the colonial powers arrived, works of Arasaratnam, Sanjay Subramaniam, Bertenstein would show us of a thriving trade network happening on the east coast, the Coromandel coast, and its strong connections between the interland and as well as the sea. In fact, Aristotle would say the peak of trade on the East Coast was around the middle 17th century, but somewhere between 1650 and 1680, and he has some kind of evidence to establish that. And it so happens that the founding of Madras coincides with this phenomenal trade that's happening on the eastern coast. Um and the development of Chennai, starting from its founding moments, which is around 1639, 1640, up until the independence period, that's 1947, could be broadly classified into four phases. The first phase starts from its founding moments and up until about 1750s, which is where The British finding its foothold, uh, increasing its trade, often challenged by various other powers around it, and it develops its own trade networks and so on. And it is closer to the 1759 is when the sort of there is this military stability, there's a political stability in the region, and Chennai starts emerging as an important settlement. Not that there was no growth in Chennai before that. There was trade and there was a settlement, but the attitude of the company towards the city wasn't very different in the pre-1750s period. The post-1750s also see the transfer of Jahir lands for the Nawab Abakat to Chennai. And Chennai, as a wonderful work by Susan Basu would say, of how Chennai became a city of villages. Even in its founding moment, Chennai had about 16 fishing villages and more than 60 other kinds of agricultural villages in its fold. And that sort of set the tone of the character of the city. And from 1750 or 1760 up until 1850 is a remarkable period where private merchant capital builds the city and various projects start emerging. A modern city is being made. You can see the seats of a major presidency town being set up during this period. And between 1850s and up and until the war of 1915 is, in my view, is a remarkable period in which Chennai, and we would see some of the most significant architectural and urban design projects, which converts the city into the city that it is partly now. Uh, that's a very important phase. And it is at this time you would see a certain imperial vision emerging. And you could see that expression in public spaces. People's Park, uh, the beach, I mean, the South Beach, the stately building fronting the beach promenade. There is a certain imperial vision that is slowly emerging at this time and gets expressed in the form. And this is also the time when the ideas of planning and architecture moves across the empire. And I'm sure the Penang also would see in this period a certain movement of ideas. There's a wonderful work by Robert Home which talks about planting and planning, where he says that there are basically three kinds of things that happened while the colonial cities were built, or when the colonial powers were in the cities that they were already built. One was the state control or the company control on the city. The second is the way in which capital moved and how it built the city and how it impacted the city. And the third is how you use space and buildings to restructure the city. For instance, in Madras, the native town, which was called the Black Town, later named the Georgetown, and the White Town, are distinctively separated by a Maidan. So the ruler and rule, which is a very classic planning device that we would see in many colonial settlements. Also very specific to Chennai, given its rich agricultural hinterland, as much as the Europeans lived within the fort, they also spread outside in the suburbs and created these garden houses. And these garden houses in 1798, which is probably the most definitive period in Chennai's history, because that was the time when Chennai was identified its own boundaries, not coming from planning perspective, from more legal perspective. They had to incorporate the suburbs because there are many rich Europeans living. So that gives a character to the city where for long Chennai was seen as a city of villages, or even up until the 60s, it was described as a rural metropolis. And this sort of a suburban sprawl that we saw for long, even we see it now, is probably anchored at that moment when the city, which could have been just limited to Georgetown, Berry, had to be sort of expanded. In the post even at this period, the city became modern, the infrastructure, etc. And the post 1915 and up until the 1945, we see the bureaucratization of the city planning. Town Planning Act is set up. There was a directorate of town and country planning. Town planning schemes are devised, and the different parts of the cities are organized. There is no more organic growth. New roads are being laid. The vast hinterlands are connected to Georgetown, which is still the hub of that. So Chennai acquires the character of, by the end of the colonial period, as a rural metropolis, a city of villages. Because in its founding moments and its subsequent history, it has a strong, dense core, and it had to connect with the hinterland, not just for only trade, it's also because the kind of settlement that it grew had to have these connections. And five major roads emerge, which connects these. Now, in the post-independence period, uh, which could have provided a wonderful break to rethink how the city could have been planned, actually flounders. The first 25 years is a remarkable period. Uh, from 1957, which was the first time a comprehensive plan for Chennai was produced and published later in 1960s, as a comprehensive vision for the city, it tries to have different kinds of infrastructure, wants to control the city growth, etc. And for it, the city was still Georgetown. But gradually, from 60s to 75, as it moves, and the first master plan is produced in 1975, the new parts of the city becomes very important for the planners, leaving out the historic course. And you could see the manifestation of overlooking of the past in favor of the new is the projects identified in Georgetown are things to sort of remove the markets and sort of all kind, leading to what you see, what could have been otherwise a wonderful, walkable, dense, lively city sort of crumbles. Not that it is deserted, but it is bereft of its life and character. I mean, it's full of life, but not the kind of quality of life it could have possibly taken. Now, the city is still a suburban city, a city of villages. So the planners start focusing on developing common road networks that evolved during the British period. The Southern Road, the GST Road, the Bangalore Highway, and the Calcutta Highway, and the Beach Road. So they try to connect the different parts of the city using these roads. Now, what it does as it grows is the city's growth is hugging along these five corridors, and the Chennai becomes a city of corridors, converting into a sort of a battery cooked pizza, where all the developments are hugging the main infrastructure, while the inter portion are not well developed. So you find the arteries choking, city sprawling, and the kind of urban services that is delivered is not adequate in the suburbs. Now, there were master plans produced and other kind of structure plans produced in 1980 and subsequently in 2008. You constantly see an overlooking of the heritage areas. For a brief moment between 1990 and 2000, you see there's a resurgence or interest in conservation. Intact gets active, plans are worked for Georgetown, plans are worked for Mylapore, which is another heritage area, but it's not carried through. In the process, all the important traces of history we are losing. I'm not only talking like in some sort of nostalgic from that perspective. To me, these neighborhoods are counterpoint to the modern city because here it's more designed for a certain density, diversity, walking, and it could possibly be a wonderful place, an alternative place for someone to live. But since the city had focused more on the new parts. Some of these old areas have been inadequately developed, and now it looks like the place where the most of the rental housing or commercial or storage is available. Now, as a consequence of our bad planning, we've also lost a lot of water bodies. And as a result, the urban floods are proving to be really disastrous. I'm raising this point because later on, I wanted to really ask you because I know Penang is also subjected to heavy rain, and how do you manage your urban floods? And particularly parts of the cities that are inadequately developed are the ones which suffer the most. And when the cities floods and the wedges are weakly developed, that's what happens. The post 2000 is the imagination of the city to be a global city or a smart city and so on. And all these grand visions, instead of putting the things together, is further and further fragmenting the city. In my view, now the city exists in three ways. One, there is an exhibition like IT corridors, new city, something which is always showcased for global investment and investors. There is a city which they don't know what to do with, but they can't even dismiss it because it's historical, like Mylapore, Georgetown. And that's showcased as a museum. Okay? It can only exist in past, it cannot exist in present. And there is a whole other section of the city which functions like a backyard, where the state investment or attention in terms of quality of housing or planning doesn't exist. I'll stop here, Anand, and I would like to hear from you how Penang responded in the post-colonial times.
Thank you, Professor Srivatsan. I think while the British the British free traders came into the region in search of spices, and probably spices strengthened the relationship between our regions. Uh, they definitely started and established the organized settlement in Penang. And like Chennai, most of Penang prior to the British establishment was a city of villages. They were coastal villages, and eventually with the advent of the establishment of the free port in 1786, an organized town was established, and that organized town grew over time. In fact, these are some early images that shows around 1910 that how fast that the city grew, and as you can see the urban footprint that it showcases the island and the mainland and the coastal regions of both the island and the main and the straits. And it remained intact on the same urban form. This is a picture from 1940, which showcases that the densification continues and within the organized town framework, while the rest of the Penang remains pretty much unurbanized. This is an image of 1970. Again, this Georgetown remains to be seen as a compact city, while the mainland is not as developed as much. Now, Georgetown, like any other British settlement, was an organized town that grew and became a dynamic city. And however, its relevance in a post-independent world was under question at the point of independence. When every country in the region gained independence, they built their own ports, they built their own infrastructure, and the relevance of a free port is lost its purpose. So when the world was what do you call closing out to the idea of free ports, Penang had to figure out a new pathway forward, and we decided to use the idea of a free port that the British established to create what we now call as a free trade zone. In fact, we were one of the pioneers in Asia to ride on the offshoring wave of global manufacturing, and we started very early on. But the sheer fact that we had a huge unemployment in the 1960s that forced us to figure out how do you create jobs, and that eventually shifted the urban growth into the further south of Georgetown, where we saw in large scale, paddy fields, coconut plantations were then quickly transformed into global manufacturing hubs. In fact, the picture here that I have is probably an image of one of those periods when I believe this was one of the founders of Intel. His vehicle was stuck in the mud, and amidst being stuck in the mud, they decided to go ahead and be part of Penang's industrial journey. And that journey has been one that has been very successful over the last 5 decades. In fact, it started in 1970, and this year marks the 50th anniversary of Penang being known as the Silicon Valley of the East. In fact, this is an image of what it looks like, and definitely Penang has become a global powerhouse. In fact, one in probably two microprocessors were produced in Malaysia, in Penang, and one in five LEDs is produced in Penang. If Penang shuts down today, definitely we are going to dent the global electronics industry, in turn affect the global economy. The story is, how did a small place like Penang become a global powerhouse in manufacturing and its success? Now that's a story for another day. But what has happened in terms of urban growth planning and so on, as you can see the maps that shows the early settlements were in the city, in the Cape in 1940s, in the city itself, Georgetown, and that grew very slowly. But that growth since 1970 has expanded to the rest of the island, and you can see it's been from moving from north to south. And while the city itself fell into decay after the free port was removed, many parts of the city started falling apart. And however, it also had the largest collection of built heritage that was intact in Asia. So on that basis, UNESCO had listed it as a UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Site for its rich character in terms of being part of the cities and the streets, its multicultural identity, and its built history. On this basis, then we put in an effort to preserve built and cultural heritage was strengthened, and this was primarily driven by a bottom-up effort led by the community. Now, buildings were restored. This was an example of one of those restorations that were done successfully, where shop houses which were in poor condition or broken down or burnt were transformed to become spectacular new uses. In this case, this particular has become one of the new icons in the city, and looks spectacular in the inside. Again, a burned down building that has been transformed. Parks were rehabilitated and restored. In fact, we even went to the extent of looking at old photographs and old images. In fact, this was one example of a park restoration. Not only buildings were restored, but rather we restored parks. And this was the final completion of this particular park. Is known as the Fountain Garden. Lane or the public pedestrian walkways were also restored to bring back the historical character. Community centers, temples were also funded and restored. Mosques, churches, temples, and so on. The whole range of community buildings were also be part of the story of transformation. That was not the only thing that we were involved in doing, but we also worked with increasing the public space. In a city like Georgetown, which became highly urbanized, public space was a rare commodity. And in this case, for this particular park fell into disuse and became a flea market. As a result of that, eventually the flea market became a thief's market, and a thief's market ended up becoming in dealing with notorious goods. When the restoration process started in the city, we had to also engage these traders. We collaborated with them and the city government and the community. We had various engagements, participation, and so on, in bringing about a new transformation and in a new park into the city. As you can see, the visual transformation of what was before and after, and how new users have now been brought about into the city. Now, obviously, it's not only the physical change, but it's also about the storytelling. It's about the protection of crafts. It's about myth making. It's about publication, history, oral history, and all of this makes a composite effort towards transformation. Festivals were introduced, events were brought about, and this today has put Georgetown into the global map. In fact, a decade ago, Penang was not in the radar screen. Today, it's now beeping. It has become a new powerhouse. In fact, cultural heritage has become a single factor that has revived the tourism sector in Penang. What was stagnating today has been, that transformation has been driven by the tourism sector. And however, the COVID has probably laid bare the fact that we become over-dependent on tourism to some extent. Now, this is what the city of Georgetown looks today. It looks now pristine. In fact, at night, it looks even more spectacular. As you can see, also the mainland, the urban footprint that has grown. But during this COVID crisis, we have seen a significant decline in visitors, and the visitors made a core part of the revival strategy of Georgetown. Parts of the city fell into quietness during when the city was locked down, while other parts of Penang were still alive, where areas that were dependent on tourism were affected badly. In fact, Penang's story has been about story about moving from a port city into an industrial city. In fact, the next phase that we are envisioning is about where can Penang's urban growth and planning and development move towards. And one pathway that we are looking and understanding because of the crisis is to adopt to become a more resilient city that takes a balanced growth approach, look at our past in terms of its rich cultural as well as its presence as a port city. Now, on that basis, we said, how can we build more out of what we have, take advantage of our cultural assets, focus on livability, and build resilience through diversification and innovation. Now, tourism definitely will start shifting quite a bit. We don't think the tourism as it was before will be there. People would look at or deeper experiences, more deeper and immersive experiences. In the past, the dollar spent in Penang was not great. In the future, we hope that will shift. There's a need to build deeper content and engagement. There's the importance because as visitors come into city, one of the key challenges will be about what would people understand about urban growth. Restoring buildings, restoring cultural site is something that we will continue. This is an example of a fort that we are currently conserving, where there's a need to do a full-scale rehabilitation, going back to the original maps. We are trying to restore the moat, bring back the moat, repair the seawall, develop new materials, archaeology, and also eventually to make this into a new visitor experience altogether. But then we have to think about using technology into a new immersive experience. Now, on the broader front about Penang, where we saw the story of transformation was anchored around Georgetown, we also think the new future for Penang will be about reinventing itself around the city of Georgetown and Butterworth. And this is one of the new initiatives that we just launched last weekend. It's called the Penang Bay Project, that we looked at about how do you build a new, a new economic zone around the coastal region that looks at building a vibrant, resilient new city core and a seamless and set of integrated coastal projects. So this is something that I encourage you all to take a look at our website or the Penang Bay Project website, where we're looking at moving Georgetown beyond the idea of just being a visitor-driven thing into repurposing the use of the city itself. Repurposing the use of the built environment is to use this to bring in new types of economic activity around the creative and technology sectors, where we are now looking at bringing in new economic use. An example would be Facebook would be headquartering in our offices later this year, and new types of companies are starting up and so on. So these are type of new activities that we see. Now, the pandemic definitely has shifted city strategy around the globe to be more agile and resilient facing crisis. However, there's a need to invest in the creative culture as part of urban rehabilitation efforts to provide leverage for its city's economic recovery. And one of the places, this is where we looked at Penang's future in. Lastly, I'm just doing a shout out about the type of work that we do as an organization. Now, one lesson that we learn in urban renewal is that you can't take a singular approach, but rather we need to take a composite approach towards renewing a city. And that requires to think at the scale of large-scale urban growth, as well as working at a very micro scale of working with communities. With that, thank you very much. I'll pass the floor back to Anwar.
Yeah, thank you, Hamdan. That was a very fascinating presentation of a beautiful roadmap, and also you led us, how Penang was reinvented and the tourists brought and all that. Still, the dollars that they seem to be spending seem to be less, but nevertheless, it seems to have been a successful, grand success. I think along with it, it also brought some problems with the tourism booming and all that. Did the real estate prices change? Were the problems there? Do you want to speak about that?
Sure, definitely. I think one of the challenges in any form of renewal is the issue of gentrification. And we have been working with the city government in terms of what we call better what you call land use or controls in terms of types of economic activities. Now, there's a need to balance between being what I would call tight-fisted versus too loose. Allowing the market to dictate is sometimes not the best thing. Neither can the arms of the government be the one that can control everything. Finding the art of finding the balance is the key. Obviously, every city has to figure out what would be the kind of balance that is needed. In the case of Georgetown, maybe there's some elements of this, the pendulum swinging too far out, and so much so that the growth was too fast. And as a result of that, in fact, to some extent, the reason of why it's listed as a UNESCO site could also possibly be could be under threat if not managed. So one of the things that we have been doing over the last decade has been that we have been running surveys to assess the kind of transformation that happens in the city. So we started the survey in 2009, we repeated the survey again in 2014, and we just completed another survey to look at the kind of shift and transformation that we are seeing in city. That means we know exactly the type of economic activity, the type of use, and the number of users, the type of people who are in the city, and that's the kind of evidence-based approach that is needed if we are going to intervene in this.
That's a very impressive presentation, not as a presentation, but the work itself. This sort of brings to me a comment or an observation and a question that I'll pose a little later. First, my observation is increasingly those who work in Indian cities, or for that matter, Asian cities, are wanting to know what are the lessons that we could possibly learn by turning south, which is the Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian cities. Because most of the models of growth and even the body of knowledge in planning and planning practices that primarily so far has come from the developed north. Okay, so there is in the last few years, and you have sort of even emphasized that without actually saying so, that there are many Asian cities which have done well. So to me, it only reminds me of what the ongoing debate in the planning practice and establishment. Is it time to look towards east or south, depending on how you see the world? And what can we sort of pick from these experiences? That's my first observation. The second thing, and then whenever you make such a wonderful presentation, there's a bunch of questions when you compare. Okay, so the first thing is, why is Penang successful? Maybe it's a small city, maybe it's wealthy, or maybe the strait is far more authoritarian or powerful. Probably the institutions are better off. But actually, the story that you have so far narrated are not just about that the city is small compared to Chennai, or the city is relatively wealthy compared to Chennai, which I don't know your figures, but you can possibly tell us how wealthy the city is. But can you explain to us that why the model of Penang is replicable to others, even though there could be certain specific differences between cities?
Okay, let me. I didn't get your first comment, Sri Watson.
I was just saying the world, instead of always looking for models of practice and ideas from the developed West, there is much Asian cities can offer each other.
Sure.
For example, I would like to know how Hong Kong deals with land and transportation, economic city. I would like to know from you how you have handled heritage. I would like to know how Seoul has done its water and so on. So I'm saying just instead of often looking to the developed north, as much the south can offer. It's more observation, not a question.
Sure, I think I agree with you in the sense that there's a lot of Asian examples that are what do you call instructive and not only it is impressive in terms of the kind of transformation that has taken place, and definitely there's plenty to learn from one another. In fact, one of the things that we believe is that creating a platform for cross-sharing this knowledge is definitely critical and important, because there's plenty that we can learn from each other. Now, in terms of the case of the story of Penang, I think the story of Penang has always been a story of the need to survive, the need to, thrive, and the need to compete. From early on our history, from the time when the British settlement was established, when Francis Slide established Penang, he didn't have the mandate of the East India Company to establish a settlement here. But then he, he managed to convince the East India they need Penang. So even the idea of Penang being starting as a port city was a non-starter for a start. And all through its history, the British moved the capital from Penang to Singapore. The central administration moved from Penang to Singapore. And Penang was always seen to be that secondary hub that is it is got its own vibe and drive and character. And probably that's what makes, maybe in the case of Penang, interesting and unique, is the people of Penang who had that DNA of wanting to survive and compete and thrive. Now, the transformation that you see in Penang is not without dislocations. Dislocations are plenty and many, but the challenge, the issue, I think what we have learned, that what we have done is to learn from all of these issues of that we see. We definitely, as we move as a society, the challenge of making sure development is inclusive. So that has been something to increase the quality of jobs and so on. No, we were not necessarily a rich country or rich city. We were as poor as as all the other cities in Asia. But over time, progress has been made. Now, Penang's progress is definitely much less than what we were seeing in Hong Kong or Singapore, but definitely much ahead than many other cities in ASEAN. So there is a sort of like both a success as well as much more to achieve. Now, the second lesson that we can share in terms of our own model is that there's a need to work at the intersection of between community, government, and the private sector business. We need to harness the potential of the private sector. We need to unlock the potential of community, while government needs to facilitate and play the role of and as an enabler to make things happen, and not they become the obstacle towards achieving things. And I think there's a need to balance that. And I think one of the lessons that we learned was both to be bottom up and top down in terms of intervention. The third is that as we deal with any form of development, there's displacement, whether it's in the urban growth when urban growth moves from north to south, or even within the renewal of the city of Georgetown. Definitely, it comes at a cost. But the thing that we need to understand is that are we conscious of the cost, and what do we do in terms of intervention that either tempers or engages these issues upfront and find ways, solutions that are needed. Sometimes the solutions are in situ, sometimes the solutions are not there yet. And I think that's an ongoing challenge as a growing city. And I think maybe that's one of the things that maybe we can share out of Penang, is to say that it is not a story that has happened, but rather it's a story still in the making.
We had asked Srivatsan, I think he'll be joining us back. But by then already, there are questions for Hamdan. And Queenie Wong, she has asked based on your presentation. Hope you're able to see it.
Sure, yeah.
How does the new park accommodate?
Sure. As I said, the park itself was, what was a place, was a park, was colonized by the traders. So the park was there before the traders, and then the traders who had colonized the space, eventually what was a flea market ended up becoming a thieves market, and to some extent it became a market whereby you could get narcotics and pornography. So eventually what has happened is that when the early engagements that we did was, there was a situation where communities were already moving out because the area was becoming unsafe. In fact, to the extent where some of the communities said, look, no, I don't think park is a priority, rather safety is a key factor. But then we pushed on, we went ahead, we created a park. The traders were given an option to move to an adjoining area, but by their choice, they moved to a larger marketplace where the flea market is organized. And and some of them continue to trade and flourish in the new zone that they have moved into on their own volition. While the park itself has contributed towards renewal of the area as a whole, what used to be a depressed neighborhood today has seen renewal and revival. So I'm sure that you call some would view that gentrification shouldn't be discouraged, but then that's the whole process of development and the balance that we need to achieve.
Okay. There's one more question, Hamdan. Uh, this is JS. I hope you can read the question. Could you say more
Well,
about your engagement with local communities, how they have reacted, adjusted to the new upscaling of their city?
or rather, the story of transformation in Georgetown is a very bottom up. When I say bottom up, is that government was not the prime driver, rather, government was involved in inscription and the overall management of the city. But the whole process of restoring buildings, renewing trade, events, festivals, and so on has been the effort of both the private sector and the community at large. And they have been the key drivers to put Georgetown into the map. Now, for the projects that we do and that we mobilize together with the government, we try to ensure that community is not an afterthought. Rather, we start even in the case of the example of the park, that we ran 3 different surveys over 2 years to get the engagement, participation, and collaboration in so that to ensure that they have always been in what do you call it before, during, and after, and not to be only seen as a tick box as part of a consultation, but rather embedded and in fact partnerships. Because we think the long-term sustainability is to ensure that community at large is actually embedded into the transformation process and equipped. In fact, I would think also enabling them to take charge of the change. In fact, at the end of the day, people make cities, and great cities is all about people.
Srivatsan, I think we lost you out for a while.
I'm
Hope
sorry, I just
yeah.
I'm back now.
I know
And
the
then I'm
audio is
sorry.
very poor. I mean, yeah, your broadband connection and all that is quite poor. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna just lost halfway through, but we can chat a little later.
I'm definitely happy to do that.
There's one other question. Where did, for Hamdan, where did the investment for the project come from? Who funded all of this?
In the case of Georgetown, as I said, most of the investment for the restoration of physical buildings has come from the private owners themselves or investors who have invested into new businesses. And for them, this has been a venture. The community buildings were done by the community through fundraising, while the government has contributed to the overall improvement of the city. And that is a progressive journey that is being made. So that's where we said it's a tripartite partnership between the what we call the government, the businesses, and the communities. And I think that's one of the beauty of this is that if we can get all three of them together to work, to collaborate, and to find ways to actually unlock value, then the outcome is definitely much more significant. And as opposed to typically in most cities, it's either left to the government to take ownership, while everyone else either is in the receiving end or taking advantage of what the government does. I think we have tried as much as possible to as much as possible allow for the kind of tripartite to prevail.
Then I have a question here for you in
Sure.
this point. See, I want to know how this process works when you work with private developers and investors. Now, who provides the vision of this project? Is there a vision which holds all the projects? Because when you say, I'm sure there will not be one developer or one investor, you'll have multiple investors doing multiple projects. So there, I'm assuming that there is some large idea which holds different projects together. One. Two, what is the relationship in terms of investment and returns between the investor and the state? And what is the role does the community play? I'll explain just briefly the background for this question. Because currently in Chennai, Georgetown, and other places such as Portsmouth, Mylapore, the old parts of the city are up for redevelopment. The process there is what they have done is what is called the collective development, where if 3, 4 developers come together, they can buy up 4 properties, 5 properties, and they would allow the developer to build those five properties with an additional FSI or increased built-up area. But as a quid pro quo, they may have to give a small space for a park or a road and things like that. But I'm not sure whether the CMDA has a vision as to how Georgetown must develop. So my fear in Chennai, unlike what you showed us in Penang, this will probably entice developers and development. But would we be able to convert it into a nice place to live in?
I think on the first issue of vision, definitely that's one of the fundamental things, as I said, that it must be evidence led, and that vision should be one that is shaped with the people. To some extent, I think that's what the journey of Penang has been. The inscription of it as a UNESCO site has been led by the community with the support of the government. There were resistance in the beginning from the private sector. In fact, huge amount of resistance to the extent where the area that was listed now is much smaller than what was originally proposed. So what we have as the World Heritage Site is a fraction of what the city of Georgetown is. Obviously, the private interest is always concerned about limiting their own potential for unlocking their economic returns. My own personal view has been that while property ownership is a right, the development of a property is a privilege, and that privilege is something that requires to be earned. And in return for what you get in terms of approvals, then there is a quid pro quo to ensure that you contribute back in a positive way back to society. Now, in the case of Malaysia, definitely there are guidelines and planning requirements that is required for any private developer or anyone in a rehabilitation project to comply, and those has got all of the specific conditions. But on top of that, there's also the things that the city government does engage the private property owners to contribute back to the city. Now, so there's two levels. One that are by regulation, by fiat. The other is by contribution. Now, obviously, in Asian countries, there's always this mindset of maximizing profit and externalizing the losses. And I think that mindset is not something that Penang can escape from. In fact, one of the setbacks in Penang is that issue of how do you balance private interest versus public outcome. And I think there's a continuing contestation, and that's some, and I think that continues to be one that we are trying to find a balance. So in some instances we have good success, some instances we do not have good success.
How do you, it's a very interesting point you're making between private interest and public good. Okay, how do you negotiate that? What are your parameters to evolve? What matters, in a negotiation with the developer?
I think most developers sometimes act out of either protecting their own private interests or sometimes not realizing what it could become. Example of the story Georgetown. One of the people who were resisted what they call for the listing of the heritage site was property developers themselves, with a view to say that, oh, if the site was listed, it would compromise the development of Penang, and there was a huge pressure from the developers to restrict the area that's being listed. But today, Penang's whole, and I would say nearly 80% of the revival of tourism in Penang has been anchored around the UNESCO World Heritage Site and cultural heritage tourism. So the huge economic benefit that has brought about Penang, putting Penang into the global map, is sometimes underestimated now. Obviously, government now realizes this big benefit that has come about, and obviously it has opened up a newer perspective. In fact, some of those property developers have themselves become heritage property owners. Those who were in the forefront in terms of resisting have become what do you call people who have now taken advantage of restoring their properties instead of knocking them down and rebuilding cover blocks. So that's a kind of thing that sometimes it's they learn through the hard way, and sometimes you need to bring a lot of opening people's minds and perspective, even though there's plenty of examples around the world that we can learn from the fact that how investing into public spaces, investing into public goods will only increase the asset price, will only reward the property owners, not the other way around.
My observation about Chennai is up and until 90s, it was state. Everything was expected to be state. So the pendulum was other side. Now, post 90s, it's moving to the other extreme of saying that everything needs to be done by the market. What I am not able to see so far is the planning agencies in Chennai either having the maturity, capacity, and a framework to influence and work with market. Either it's gone to the one side or it's the other side. So what you're explaining is a certain healthy negotiation. I'm sure you're giving us a very smooth story, but it's full of friction with contestations and negotiations. All
Yes,
things
yes.
go through that. But what I'm able to appreciate from what you're saying is that you have a capacity and a framework to discuss and negotiate with the developer because you are clear about what the public outcome should be. And I see that's what I seriously miss in Chennai, particularly the agencies involved in development.
No, I guess maybe I have simplified it, but essentially, as I said, that there is it's like a tug of war, and eventually there's a need to balance. Obviously, that tug of war has got all form of interferences between the bureaucrat and the business owners or the asset owners. Definitely, there's huge amount of influences from outside parties to shape the outcome, and this could come from different interest groups, from political to community groups to private interests. And I think what happens is the question of eventually, once we are learning more and more, the more we are able to have open engagement, the more we are able to create participation, the more we are able to not do things behind in private conversations, the better the outcome is for the city. Now, what
Yeah,
we need to encourage is a more open engagement between different actors, because, as I said earlier, that cities is all about people. If we do not build our effort towards getting people to the focal point of every discussion, then we lose the opportunity to build cities. While we can reward private property owners by gaining huge amount of gains, but that is at the expense of externalizing the losses to society. And I think that's one of the things that we hope that we can build a broader coalition of people to be aware of the fact that we're not discouraging people from making profit, but profit must be made with responsibility.
well said. Anwar, is there a question or I could just make some comment?
Yeah, this I think one other shared thing. I think we'll conclude this. We have reached the time limit. Shared thing is that both the cities uh, have this Heritage Day. I mean, many cities have, but Madras has been quite active for the last decade or so with Mr. Mutaya, initiating it with other friends. And Penang, I think, has July 7th
Yes.
July as a Heritage Day. But I think the difference between these two, I do not know much about the Penang experience. In Madras, it has been all people driven. It's completely kind of, anyone can come in and then organize their own festivals. And I'm doing it on my own. We are doing it on our own. And QIAMS International Academy of Media Studies for that umpteen number of people. But then there is with one point where we all collaborate. It's not necessary that everyone has to collaborate over there. Everyone can do the programs. But how is the Georgetown Festival? Is it kind of centralized organizing, or how does it happen?
The festival itself, I think that it's a state-led effort, and because it's a public holiday, and they've declared it as part of celebrating the UNESCO inscription. But the Georgetown Festival itself is the largest, though it's state-led. There's a lot of participation from various private groups as well as businesses as well as communities who participate and partake in the celebration of the city. This includes, hosting events or providing what do you call services, amenities, and making the city attractive for people to visit. What has happened over the period is that there's also given birth from the Heritage Day to a Georgetown Festival. Now we also have a Georgetown Literary Festival. So there's been other spillover effects that has come as a result of one festival building to another festival, and it has gained momentum such that what do you call it? Because at the end of the day, it makes a lot of business sense for businesses, while communities get a platform to showcase and share their cultural history.
There
Uh,
are, yeah, please go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, we're good. I was just about
Yeah,
to make two
uh,
wrap up comments, but if you have
okay, there are
something.
two other questions. So one is JS has asked, and then that Indian cities COVID-19 unleashed a crisis for the poor. Has the private sector cushioned this impact for labor in Penang?
Okay, is this a question in about in for me or
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
I
you.
think
for
for
both of
people
us?
from Penang, so it's obviously for you.
Okay, in the case of the COVID crisis, I think government has stepped in to provide all forms of support, protection for jobs, moratorium against loans, and there's also been looking at how to alleviate the issue of people being unemployed. But the crisis is one that continues. We don't know whether when we will see a post-COVID environment. In fact, in all likelihood, we could be living with COVID for a long time. The challenge, like, is the question of whether are we prepared to face a new normal. The fact that we may need to live with COVID, and that also means that there would be displacement, and the question of what are we going to do with the displacement in terms of losses in jobs. In the case of the heritage sector, the tourism sector is definitely the worst affected by virtue of the fact that without visitors, we have seen some hotels have closed and so on. People have lost jobs. So some of these things, I think one of the efforts is to see whether there are going to be new areas where they can be redeployed. While we have seen the job losses in Penang, we also seen significant amount of job creation was also emerging. While on one end we have seen people are affected by the crisis, there's a huge growth of as a result of the COVID crisis. The world is digitizing, and given the fact that we are extensively involved in technology-based manufacturing, the number of these factories are running in full capacity and expanding. So it's a question of whether we are able to retrain and redeploy people and find ways to actually ensure that the dislocation is not one that's going to be protracted and deep.
Yeah, thank you. I think it has been the same experience here also in Chennai. I think the job type profile is kind of shifting. Digital people who are well trained, they get new job opportunities have opened up, but certain traditional ones have died down. There's one more question to uh, Hamdan.
Yes.
This is about raising the value of asset owners through creating more public spaces. Who are the majority of the property owners in Georgetown? Are they locals or foreigners or major corporations?
I think traditionally a lot of the assets in Georgetown is owned by by private owners as well as community organizations. One of the things in the city of Georgetown is that either family groups or all they have clan associations or wakafs or also asset owners. Now, since the listing, there has been an increased level of external interest in terms of investing into the city. And to some extent, some transactions have seen foreigners also acquiring these assets. So on one level, it's welcome the fact that people are investing and rehabilitating these assets, which were in a state of decline and decay. But on the other hand, obviously, there's always concerns. We have seen some of the things that has happened in Georgetown, where on block, all of a sudden, buildings with character and identity looks unique. Looks uniform and sanitized. So it loses the character of the city itself, what Georgetown used to be, because Georgetown is rough on the edges. And when you lose that kind of identity, then that becomes a matter of concern. Now, this is where we said that early on that the need for stronger regulation, and we are still finding our footing in terms of a stronger regulatory environment that doesn't discourage investment, but rather also balances the need to ensure that it will also not limit the possibilities of how the private sector can unlock the potential of the city. So we are trying to figure out how best that can be done.
Shreyas, would you like to wrap it up?
Yeah, I have three comments to make as a wrap up. The first is I think the point about post-COVID, which we saw in a sense in a very different way at the or during the 2015 floods in Chennai. The resilience nature of the city from a state preparedness, um, I think it's not fully sunk in. So a certain complacency about that cities are not vulnerable. Okay, so I think since tsunami, it's been repeatedly, the cities have been reminded that they're not really as stable as they imagine themselves to be, particularly given the two cities which are very close to water. And also this something like COVID, which can be very global. So how a city comes back, because certain things cannot be predicted and cannot be even stopped. But I think a lot of emphasis is how quickly can a city come back and conduct itself in a more equitable way is possibly the challenge. And there's some efforts in Chennai in this pandemic, but always one felt that could have been much better. So I see you're also struggling with the notion of the resilience. My second point, I think what it appears to me is that you are very convincingly sold or convinced the asset owners and the investors that a conservation is a good strategy for development. It is not an antithesis for development, which is often that it is pitched. So you're able to see certain amount of success. And I also see, we can talk about it later some other time, but you're far more entrepreneurial. You're more like an entrepreneur in the city, not simply as a regulatory thing. You want something to be done. And that seems to be an important spirit, which I see slightly missing in this. But however, as Anwar said, having been critical about the city a bit, I want to stop by on a positive note. However, events such as Madras Week, the music festival, the energy which the book fairs bring to the city, and this the tremendous response citizens did in the 2015 times actually tells us there is a tremendous community level commitment and a sort of an entrepreneurial character. The problem seems to be that there is no way in which the state and its planning instruments and practices is able to or willing to co-opt this. And often certain projects are shrouded in secrecy and mystery, and always the citizens are reacting rather than participating. We can already see this happening as we talk. Something is happening in the city, and absolutely many of us are not have any clue about it. But I see there's a tremendous possibility, just as you have demonstrated, Chennai could also have some of the best practices, because there is a potential commitment and a spirit, but it is that gap between the state and the citizens which needs to be bridged. Thank you. We're lovely listening to you all then.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing us to share our experiences. I personally believe that this journey is not one that we can go alone. Definitely, there's plenty to learn and plenty to really, I think, connect on. In fact, when we started Georgetown Festival, one of the festivals that we were inspired on was the Chennai Festival. The fact that it has lasted nearly 100 years, it's amazing. It's self-organized, spontaneous, and it's got its own set of followers. So there are things that we constantly learn from each other, and I don't think whatever that we have done is perfect. There's a lot of imperfection, but I think what we need to have confidence is about taking the first step forward. And as I said earlier, that we personally believe and take the philosophy to say that it's about partnership, collaboration to shape a possibility of what we all want.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Hamdan. Thank you, Srivatsan. It has been a wonderful presentation, sharing of ideas, a conversation. My apologies that Srivatsan's mic was a bit low. He is also outside the city, and the broadband connection was a bit of a problem. Hopefully, next lectures, we didn't have that. So tomorrow we have company paintings, East India company paintings, being The lecture is given by Dr. Sapna Satish, who is Professor of Fine Arts in Shalamars College. And day after tomorrow, I'll be speaking on the Nawabs of Arcot in Madras. And Friday, finally, it's all about the city, the fight for this city, fight to retain Madras as the capital of Tamil Nadu. That's being spoken by T. Parmeshwari. The lecture will be in Tamil. She is the granddaughter of Mapo Sivanyanam, who also led that fight for the LIU to Poratam. So please, tune in, come at 7 o'clock, log in. We'll be there on Facebook as well as YouTube. As a parting, I'm just leaving you with what is there for tomorrow. Thank you once again, Srivatsan and Hamdan.
Thank you.
Thank you.